I'm Kelda Roys, and I'm running for state senate in the 26th district. I'm a former state representative and legislative leader. I served in the Wisconsin Assembly and helped lead the protest against Act 10. And I'm an attorney by training, and I own a small business. I'm also a mom and stepmom of 4 girls.
Okay. I'm Greg Jaboski. I'm the secretary of the steering committee of the Dane County chapter of Our Wisconsin Revolution. And Kayla.
My name is Kayla Barrett, and I'm the president of the Columbia County, Sauk County chapter for Our Wisconsin Revolution.
Okay. And let me make sure I have, there we go. Kayla, do you have the questions up?
I do.
Okay, great. You want to go first or should I?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Do you support publicly funded elections? Why or why not?
Absolutely. I've been a longtime supporter of publicly financed campaigns because I think that we see what happens when elections are privately funded. You get dark money flooding in because of Citizens United and corporations and organizations that really don't have our best interest at heart controlling policy. I don't want to live in a country where the wealthiest and the most powerful get the biggest say in our democracy. And there's a long line of, I think, very mistaken Supreme Court cases that have made it very difficult for us to continue with a privately funded election system. So in my view, a publicly financed campaign system is the only way that we can expand access to people being able to run for office. You know, when I first ran, I was 29. I didn't have a lot of wealthy friends. I worked at yet I was able to run and win because that was an election you could win by doing doors. And I would like to see more people be able to run for office and win, even without being backed by wealthy special interests. And of course, we'll get better policies that way too.
Do you favor extending the time frame to vote at the polls during elections to a minimum of 2 weeks ahead of the election date?
Absolutely. I think we need widespread early voting, and I was very disappointed to see the recent court ruling limiting early voting to the 2-week period before the election. Ideally, I'd like to see both universal vote by mail with in-person voting only really as a stopgap measure to help anybody who's unable to vote by mail. And I also want to see universal adult franchise. That means eliminating voter registration and making sure that every adult has the right to cast their ballot. So not taking away the right to vote for people who are incarcerated, et cetera.
What model or plan do you prefer for redistricting?
I've been a longtime board member of Common Cause, and so I favor an independent style redistricting. I'd love to see one that has a lot of citizen leadership and participation, but the main thing is that we want to make sure that it's not politicians picking their voters. It's the other way around. I'd like to see districts based on political competitiveness, because I think competitive elections are very good for democracy. And you know, if you look at states like Iowa, where they have independent, nonpartisan redistricting processes, they have the most competitive elections. So I'd love to see that in Wisconsin. And I'll just say that this has been a consistent position of mine, even when Democrats had the majority and I was in the legislature, and the Democratic leadership was eager to draw their own lines after the 2010 census. I was advocating, you know, in our caucus, along with some other Democrats and Spencer Black, who was leading the charge at the time, that we needed to pass independent redistricting. And sure enough, Democrats lost the majority, and now Wisconsin has the worst gerrymander in the nation.
What are your top 3 legislative priorities, and what will you do to move them through the legislature?
Well, I think the most important priority that Wisconsin faces is addressing the huge inequalities in our state and in our society. I mean, certainly wealth inequality and economic disparities, but also racial disparities. I'd like to see that addressed through tax fairness, finally asking the wealthiest and biggest corporations to pay their fair share, and Green New Deal, which could help create jobs, create a stronger middle class, and help us address the climate crisis. Number 2, I think, is healthcare for all. I've been a longtime supporter of Medicare for all at the federal level, and in 2008 campaigned in favor of Healthy Wisconsin, which would have been a state version of Medicare for all. And I think healthcare just absolutely has to be a right, and especially right now in the pandemic. And I would say the third priority is public education. You can't have a strong economy and you can't have a functioning democracy unless you have educated people. And Wisconsin used to be the education state. So I would like to see us reinvest in funding not just K-12, but higher ed, addressing the student loan debt crisis and expanding access to early childhood education. You know, and especially as we are in this period of uncertainty over the next couple of years, we have to address what is going to happen with childcare and with schools. And I just don't see a lot of attention being paid to that. And it's an absolutely urgent question, not just for our kids, but for all working parents. We can't reopen the economy unless we can figure out what's going to happen with all of these children.
In the emergence from the pandemic, would you support a state-level economic hardship payment? Do you support direct payments to residents? And please describe the top 5 components that you think should be in such a bill.
Yes, I would. And yes, I would. So briefly, I think we do need economic hardship payments. I think it's, you know, these one-time things are unpredictable, and that makes it very hard for people to budget and to plan their lives. So I would like to see something like, you know, a UBI payment. And I think this is kind of an ideal situation where, you know, having a basic monthly payment that people can rely on, especially people who are the most vulnerable workers, who are low-wage workers and aren't really making enough to make ends meet. That could be essential to keeping our economy going and to keeping those households going. I'd also like to see expanded unemployment and the pandemic unemployment assistance programs with immediate approval and payment. You know, right now it's like you have to prove that you're eligible. I would like to flip that presumption on its head so that there's no waiting period. If you apply, you're eligible, you're presumed eligible. And then if they find out a couple months later, oh, turns out you were not eligible, then they can go, you know, back. But, you know, there's just thousands and thousands of families who are struggling, and they are really at the end of their financial rope, and they don't know when they're going to get that unemployment determination or payments. That's unconscionable. Number 2, I think it's essential that we would have universal paid family and sick leave so that anyone is able to take off from their job without fear of being fired. I'd like to see longer, but I think 12 weeks is the absolute minimum. Third, I think Medicaid expansion is really essential. Not only will it help cover, you know, something like 85,000 additional Wisconsinites, but it will create 10,000 new healthcare jobs at a time when our economy really badly needs that. And I'd like to see, you know, all COVID testing and treatment be completely free for all Wisconsinites. Fourth, I talked about this a little earlier, targeted funds for schools, for daycares, and for healthcare facilities, not just for personal protective equipment and for sanitation, but also for things like extra space and extra staffing that are going to be necessary to have these places safely functioning and have people who are working there be protected. And then fifth, I think we need expanded infrastructure investments. You know, think about how public employment can help our economy and help Wisconsin pay off some of the deficits that we've built up in our infrastructure. I mean, not just roads, but especially things like mass transit, broadband, which is even more essential now to support virtual learning, clean energy, and public health. All these areas we have kind of neglected from an infrastructure perspective. So I think putting people to work and making those important investments in infrastructure are all going to be important components of any pandemic recovery bill.
How will you guarantee housing to citizens? How will you deal with the financial situation of those facing eviction because of the pandemic? And what specific solutions would you propose?
Well, I have a very detailed platform on my website on housing, and I would encourage anyone to go to keldaroys.com and take a look under the housing thing. This is an issue that I'm really passionate about because I'm an attorney, and my small business is related to housing. It was very important to me as a progressive small business owner that we be a voice standing up against the very conservative and regressive policies of developers and a lot of the real estate industry. We've always donated a portion of our profits to groups that work on ending homelessness, and we've been a strong advocate for progressive policies that I think help our communities and help ensure housing for people. Specifically, I think we need to expand the eviction moratorium. We are going to face an absolute crisis in evictions in the coming months as people are unable to make their rent payments and landlords are forcing them out of their homes. This, is especially devastating, not just from an economic perspective, but from a public health perspective. So making sure we're preventing evictions, I think, is absolutely essential and needs to happen now. We can't wait till January when I'm inaugurated. And I'm talking with legislators who are currently in office about this. We also need to provide a right to counsel in housing court. A huge percentage of people who are taken to housing court actually have a defense or could come to a settlement with their landlord without losing their housing. But because they don't have a lawyer and the landlord does, they never even get a chance to really raise that defense. So just like we provide a right to counsel for defendants who are indigent, we should also do it for people in housing court. We need additional emergency funds for rent assistance and to help people maintain their housing, because it is much less expensive to maintain someone's safe housing than to rehome them after they go through a period of experiencing homelessness. We have to restore the tenant protections that have been taken away by Republicans over the last several legislative cycles. I also really think that exploring cooperative purchasing and tenant unions and other kinds of progressive reforms are important. I have just a lot of ideas on housing, too many to really talk about in this forum and keep within the time limits, but this is something I'm really passionate about, and it's an absolute crisis waiting to happen on top of the underlying insecurity that we've already had. And as I'll just close with this, I've been appointed to the Community Development Authority, which oversees the public housing stock in Madison. One thing that's abundantly clear is that we need a lot more public housing. We need public housing units, all throughout the city. I would like to see income and racially integrated public housing. I think that's very important. And we, right now we have so many more people on the waiting list. You can be on the waiting list for years and years and years and never get public housing. And the same is true for the Section 8 vouchers that people can take to private housing providers. We need to really expand our local here in Madison and our state capacity for public housing. So thanks for asking the question.
Will you fight for a single-payer healthcare system at the state level? Do you support a single-payer healthcare system?
Yes, I do. And this was one of the early things that I campaigned on. The first time I ran for, there was a proposal on the table by Senator John Erpenbach called Healthy Wisconsin that would have been a state answer to Medicare for all. And I think, had we enacted it back then, we would be in a much better position to weather this pandemic and the resulting economic disaster that we're facing. To me, healthcare is just a fundamental human right, and we cannot call ourselves a civilized nation if people are still dying because they can't afford treatment, or losing their home or their retirement savings because they got sick or got in an accident, and you've got people who have to choose between prescription drugs and buying food. That is just wrong, and it's shameful that we haven't done this more quickly. And as somebody who, before I was in the legislature, was a healthcare advocate as executive director of NARAL Pro-Choice Wisconsin, this is an issue very close to my heart. And I think, especially representing Madison, and the person who holds the Senate seat has a special obligation to be a healthcare advocate and champion.
Will you pass workers' rights laws helping those who are forced to return to work but who risk infection from COVID-19? Absent the equivalent of a single-payer system, will you push the state to guarantee medical coverage through Badger Care for those affected in this way?
Yes, 100%. And I was delighted to see the recent introduction of the Healthcare Heroes Act, which does address the safety of workers who are essential in this pandemic. It's not just healthcare workers, but it's people who work in the grocery stores and people who deliver food. And, and a lot of these workers don't have the benefit of a union. They are, they're working for wages that would not be considered a living wage. So they more than some other categories of workers, I think, really need extra state protection. Certainly having access to adequate safety equipment, but also having economic and healthcare security so that if anything goes wrong, they are cared for and that it won't come out of their pocketbook. yeah, this is just such an essential thing. My stepdaughter is a CNA, and you know, it's very scary to think about her going into the hospice center where she's worked and not having adequate protective equipment, or if something happens to her. Fortunately, she's still on our insurance because she's young, but nobody should be in that situation.
All right, I'm going to go down a list here. If you could just give me a quick yes or no to start. Do you
Sure.
support the propositions outlined in Campaign Zero, which include end broken windows policing,
Yes.
community oversight,
Yes.
limiting the use of force,
Yes.
independently investigate and prosecute,
Yes.
community representation,
Of course. Yes.
body cameras and filming the police,
Yes, with the caveat that I think it's also important to listen to community voices, and especially marginalized communities who say that they are not in favor of body cameras and police. I mean, I think we have to, you know, Madison went through a long process, and I think we need to respect that process. I definitely support, you know, having body cameras, and certainly it's raised the issue, but I think we can't steamroll the voices of local leaders of communities that are most affected by police brutality on this particular issue.
additional training for police,
Yes.
and for-profit policing,
Yes.
demilitarization.
Of course. Yes.
All right, going to a few more, some more questions about policing. You know, it'll be some of these are municipal questions, but I know this also can come up in the legislature. First one's fill in the blank. I will support what funding for the police? And choice there: increasing funding for the police, leveling funding for the police, decreasing funding for the police, or eliminating funding for the police.
Well, when I hear defund the police, what I hear is people saying, let's do to these militarized forces what the Republicans have done to public education for the last 40 years. And that is to take away resources and divert them to other things. And, you know, I'm a lawyer by training, and we all want to live and deserve to live in safe communities, right? And the question is really, how do we create safe communities? We know that increased policing and with the brutality and the use of force that we're seeing across the country, that more police is not making us safer. Mass incarceration has not made us any safer. And I'm not just talking about for communities of color, although they bear the brunt. I'm talking about for white and affluent people too. Real public safety is created when we make investments in communities and in neighborhoods and in people. It's things like having universal early childhood education. It's having well-resourced public schools. It's having public amenities like transit and parks and welcoming buildings. It's people having access to healthcare, and it's people having living wage jobs that help them support their families. That's how you create public safety. And, you know, frankly, all the money that we're spending bankrupting our states and municipalities, putting towards a punitive, ineffective, and racist systems of law enforcement and you know, corrections should be much better spent on the front end on the things that will actually create real public safety and that will be racially just. And I mean, I've been a longtime supporter of the Campaign Zero items that you went through, but frankly, I think we have to do more than that. And I've put together a detailed plan on my website about not only ending police brutality, but also ending mass incarceration. And I think, you know, this is an urgent question, not just because we've had, you know, generations of racial injustice and violence towards communities of color that's been state sponsored, but also because of COVID. When you have people who are in jail and prison, they're at extremely high risk for COVID. And, you know, so the question, again, it can't wait for months and years. We have to address it immediately.
Who did you support in the Democratic Party presidential primary this year, and why? When did you start publicly supporting them?
I supported Elizabeth Warren, and I started supporting her at some point, I think early last fall, and, you know, started attending organizing meetings and calling through folks to try to get other elected official endorsements. I think she publicly rolled out my endorsement with a group of like legislators and things like that. I don't know exactly when that happened, but I was publicly supporting her pretty early on last fall. And why? Sorry, why was I supporting? Sorry, because her vision for what this country should be closely aligns with mine. I want to see progressive, responsive, effective government that, that gives working people across this country a shot to succeed and make sure that the wealthiest and big businesses don't get to run roughshod over our political system anymore and be calling all the shots. I want to see the breakup of big tech, and I want to see, the restoration of civil rights in this country. And I also just found her extremely smart and passionate and very, very detailed in her plans of how she was going to get it done. And in looking at the horrible person who occupies the White House right now, I think having someone with her deep knowledge and understanding of how government works and of the administrative agencies, it just seemed like she would be the perfect antidote to help repair some of the horrible damage, the generational damage that the current occupant of the White House has wreaked on our democracy. That said, I am all on board for just getting rid of Trump. The Supreme Court decision today, letting your boss impair your ability to access birth control if the corporation that you work for has a moral objection. It just needs to underscore that this is absolutely urgent. We've got to get Trump out of there, get the white supremacists and the white nationalists out of the White House, and restore some semblance of responsive government.
What is your analysis of the Evers administration handling of the COVID-19 crisis in Wisconsin, including its handling of the processes leading up to the April 7th election? And the same for your analysis of the state legislature's role in that.
Well, I think it's very unfortunate that the response has been politicized, and that, what you see is a lot of Democratic administrations and some Republicans really taking a science-based approach to protect public health. And then Republicans in some states, including in Wisconsin, doing everything they can to score political points and undermine that. If I had been governor, if I had a magic wand, I certainly would have wanted to be acting more decisively and more quickly to protect people's health, and understanding that, even before people were really talking about this, that was really the time to be acting and preparing before this really kind of hit the public radar. But that said, the major obstacle to Wisconsin's ability to handle this pandemic has been the Republicans, and that's one reason why we have to be absolutely focused on winning legislative seats all around the state.
Are you supportive of the BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions movement?
Yes, and I also oppose the bill that passed in the last session to try to limit BDS and make things harder on that movement.
This is, you've answered part of this, but do you believe that protesting is a form of speech, and therefore the right to do so, including BDS and also anti-pipeline movements, which has also had recent legislation passed, should not be punished?
Yeah, I mean, I founded an ACLU chapter when I was in law school. Protesting is speech. Of course it is.
Okay. Kayla?
List the unions that have already endorsed you in this race. Which labor endorsements are you seeking?
Well, I'm really proud that I've received, I think there have only been 2 union endorsements in this race thus far that I've seen, and they both endorsed my campaign. The first is LIUNA, the Laborers International, and they represent 5 different unions. And then I was also endorsed by the Building Trades Council, which I believe represents about 17 different unions. And so that was very exciting. I've also been endorsed by labor leaders like Peter Rickman, who runs MASH, the Milwaukee Area Service and Hospitality Workers, and has been very active on the front lines of trying to increase unionization, as well as John Matthews, the longtime executive director of Madison Teachers, Inc. So I have really broad union support, and I think that stems a lot from my outspoken work when Act 10 was happening and I was the Democratic caucus chair in the state assembly. Many late nights at the Capitol, many, dozens and dozens of protests, and my absolute commitment to organized labor and building union power so that we can have real representation and democracy in our workplace and in our government.
Regarding fundraising, this is kind of a long and detailed one. Regarding fundraising, how much have you raised for this race to date? Who are your top 3 donors? What percentage of your total is from these top donors? How much of it is strictly from small individual donors of less than $50? And if this is not your first election, please answer this question regarding your last election also.
Okay, so I had to run some numbers and I wrote them down, so just excuse me if I'm referring over here. First of all, obviously, I do support public financing for campaigns. I think it's outrageous that, running for office requires money. It requires people to, call and ask for money for so many reasons. But that said, I mean, that's the system that we have right now. And I'm really proud that my campaigns, every campaign I've run has been a grassroots campaign that's been powered by dozens to hundreds of volunteers that are committed to building a more progressive Wisconsin. And so, that's always been my approach. Our fundraising numbers for this race are going to be coming out on July 15th. And so at that point it will be public. I have raised a substantial amount of money. I will have the resources that I need to win this race. And I've also taken every no money pledge that there is, the no NRA money, no fossil fuel money. And in fact, I was one of the first federal candidates in 2012 to run a credible federal campaign on a no corporate PAC money pledge. So this is an issue that I've been passionate about for a long time. In this race, let's see, the top 3 donors are the laborers who gave contributions from all of their members. A gentleman who is an immigrant and an entrepreneur, a gentleman of color, who's been a long supporter of mine, and my dad. The average contribution amount is a little over $100, $115. About 2/3 of the contributions were $50 or less, and 82% were $100 or less. I think one of the things that is often overlooked is where are your contributions coming from? And in my case, I'm really proud to say that 36% of our contributions from this race were from in the 26th district, and nearly 90% of the contributors in this race live in Wisconsin. So it shows you that, the investment in my candidacy is people who live here and want to make Wisconsin a great place and share our vision for how to do that. In terms of my last race was in 2018. I ran for governor in the Democratic primary, ran a very, very progressive race. I garnered 4,539 contributions in that race. Of that, about 70% were $50 or under, and about 84% were $100 or less. So as you can see, a long history of grassroots campaigning and a real commitment to campaign finance reform and to running my campaigns in a way that's consistent with progressive values.
Do you support the legalization of recreational cannabis, including the expungement of all previous cannabis-related charges and the release of all those currently serving time for such charges?
100%, yes, I do. And I have supported decriminalization for a long time. In fact, when my first session in the legislature, there was a medical marijuana bill, and I was one of the few co-authors, even when this was really not an issue that had hit the mainstream yet. So I've definitely been on this bandwagon for a long time, not just because it's an issue of personal freedom and autonomy, but it's also an issue of racial justice. And in Wisconsin, we have the worst racial disparities in the nation. And it's, you know, the war on drugs is one of the ways that those racial disparities have been made worse. So I have a whole section on my website for cannabis legalization, for how we can appropriately tax and regulate cannabis, make sure that communities that have been harmed by the criminalization of cannabis actually get a fair share in the wealth that can be created when we legalize cannabis, how we can help Wisconsin farmers and agriculture. So I invite people who are interested in this issue to check out my website and the long section that I have on cannabis.
And the last question, related to internal campaign things again. Do you have paid staff or consultants working on your campaign? And what percentage of your campaign funding goes to paid staff or consultants?
So I have one paid staffer on this campaign, and you know, she's wonderful. She's my campaign manager, and all of the other positions, kitchen cabinet folks, are doing this on a volunteer basis. You know, fortunately, because I have spent, you know, the last 20 years working to enact progressive policies at the state and local level and help elect progressive Democrats to office, I have a lot of people who are very eager to, you know, support me. And so, you know, I've just had a lot of wonderful, enthusiastic volunteers who are helping us by making thousands of calls and writing postcards. So I haven't had to really pay consultants, although I do have, you know, people who are experts in their field working on my campaign. They're just not getting a retainer as they often would on a more, you know, on a campaign that they'd be doing the kind of work on. And I'm really proud to say that the person who's doing my targeting and voter file work was actually Bernie Sanders's top targeting expert, who built all of his voter models in his 2016 race and then worked again on his presidential earlier this cycle. So I've got some very, very top tier talent, and I feel extremely lucky that that we've built, you know, such a great and broad campaign with so many smart and committed people.
Thank you very much.